Good evening and namaste everyone. On behalf of Fintas Pharmaceutical, I Dr. Mithilesh Nayak once again welcome you all to this 8th series in the Practice Pulse in Endocrinology webinar. And today we are going to discuss about important aspect, that is the diet. So today to guide us, we are having with us Dr. Sauvik Goswami and Dr. Ranjini Datta ma'am. And to moderate this session, we are having with us Dr. Professor Subhankar Chaudhary sir. He is the well-known endocrinologist from the city of Kolkata, and currently he is the head of the Department of Endocrinology at SSKM Hospital, Kolkata. So now I request Dr. Subhankar Chaudhary sir to take us further. Over to you, sir.
A very good evening and a warm welcome. And it's close to, Happy Bihu, Makar Sankranti and Pongal and everything to all of you across our varied and beautiful country, and also a very happy new year. Diet is something that is very important, we understand, but often as busy clinicians, we cannot afford to pay the amount of importance that it actually has. And there is clearly a chasm, a division between what your patient thinks about diet, of course, and what you as a physician think about diet. While we may think that we eat to live, most patients would feel that they live to eat. And then, of course, if they see you or me, I don't know about Dr. Ranjini Datta, in one of our conferences, then I'm sure many of the physicians and many of our patients will not pay any attention to whatever advice we have given them, because quite often we ourselves don't follow, we don't practice what we preach. So diet is important. Of course, it gives us nutrition. And then, of course, it's related to the origin of disease conditions, leads to obesity, could give rise to obesity. But there are a lot of myths related to diet. And to take us through, this evening we have got two interesting perspectives, aspects of discussion about diet. Of course, as we know, this is supposed to be an hour-long program. So we clearly can't make it too long, too exhaustive, but we always try and make it as interesting as possible. So the first part, we have a talk by an endocrinologist who will talk about myths related to diet, or maybe talk of, so let's say talk of the myths related to diet. And in the second part, we'll have a more sort of practical, hands-on, but of course theoretical discussion as to how to devise, how to plan a healthy diet and get really the nuts and bolts about to what is a portion size, how much of a what, because it's all good to hear, to read that you need to take 55% of carbohydrate and maybe up to maximum of 30% of fat and the rest from proteins, but you don't get to buy a carbohydrate or a fat or a protein in the market. You can't just go out and ask for 55% carbohydrate. So you need to know what are the foodstuffs which provide you with all these combinations. And then again, we don't eat one single food item. We eat a mixed diet. So that's all very important. And we can get some inkling as to the complex process by which our nutrition colleagues work in order to help our patients. And at the end, I promise you, you have an interesting quiz. And if you are scoring, if you are possibly following these talks well, hopefully you will be able to win some prizes. So we come to the first part of the talk, and we welcome our very young, dynamic endocrinologist, Dr. Sauvik Goswami, who is in the faculty of the Department of Endocrinology at the NRS Medical College in Kolkata. And he also is involved in all the other associations in diabetes, in endocrinology, and plays an active role in many of these, whether at the local level or even at the national level. So welcome to this evening's party, Dr. Soumik Goswami.
Thank you, sir, for that very kind introduction, and a very good evening to one and all who has joined in, who has tuned into today's endocrine practice pearls. So when we talk of diet, a very famous quote is often attributed to Hippocrates, when nearly 2,500 years ago he said that let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And like most of his other quotes, he was very, very correct, far ahead of his time. Because if we look at all recent studies, we have come to know that 1 out of every 5 deaths that occur globally is related to a dietary factor. It contributes to 11 million deaths globally. And unfortunately, a big proportion of all that is wrong with the diet is related to dietary myths and misconceptions. Now, what has actually gone wrong with our diet? If we want to know what has gone wrong with our diet, we need to look at how we have evolved. Once we started walking erect about 20 lakh years ago, we spent most of these 20 lakh years as hunter-gatherers or foragers, eating mostly wild vegetables, wild fruits, wild crops, and of course, wild animals. It's only 10,000 years that we have organized ourselves into a society which cultivates food, and we have moved mostly to cereals, mostly to carbohydrates. And over the last 200 years, we have moved to ultra-processed food. So that 80% of all that you get on a supermarket shelf today was not available 100 years ago. So there's a huge mismatch between our genes and the food that we eat. And on top of that, if you put in dietary myths, that's even worsening things further. So I'll take you through myths related to salt intake, related to the use of sugars, fruits, and sweeteners in diabetes, related to fat, because the general conception is if you eat fat, you're going to become fat and you're going to die early. And of course, eggs and cholesterol. Fluid restriction, we know, has a role in kidney disease, but there's a notion that if you drink a lot of fluid, your kidney is going to stay good. What about protein restriction in kidney disease? I'll be dealing with that. Diet and uric acid, particularly with regard to intake of high purine vegetables and hyperuricemia. The so-called thyroid diet, I'll take you through that as well. And of course, I'll take you through certain specific dietary patterns like the Mediterranean diet or the very popular, at least in some places, ketogenic diet. But salt is something which needs most of our attention, because if we look at all that is wrong with diet, the thing that has gone most wrong relates to a diet which is high in sodium, which is the leading dietary factor for death. Of course, we don't take enough fruits, enough vegetables, enough whole grains. We take more of refined carbohydrates. But the worst thing that has happened to our diet is that we take more sodium than necessary. And if we think that if we could simply remove the salt shaker and avoid taking excess salt, added salt rather, with our meals, we would do away with excess sodium, we would be very wrong, because 2/3 of all sodium that we take comes from processed foods, comes from ready-to-eat foods. Even the simple innocuous turkey sandwich that you get in Subway has as much as 1.5 grams of sodium, which is actually 2/3 of your daily recommended sodium intake. So processed foods are our main enemy. When it comes to hidden sodium, most of our sodium comes from there. Now, you could argue that I don't have hypertension and I do take a lot of salt. So does it matter? Yes, it does matter, because hypertension, of course, is one of the leading mechanisms by which excess salt can hit your cardiovascular system. But even otherwise, it alters your renin-angiotensin system. It provokes chronic inflammation. It provokes it increases levels of interleukin-17, which increases T helper cell activity, leading to certain immune responses. It alters your gut microbiome. And if you take too much salt, you put out more calcium through your urine, which subsequently could lead to bone damage as well. So even if you are normotensive and if you take excess salt, you could damage your heart, your brain, your kidney. And if it doesn't get you through those organs, it could always hurt your stomach or your bones. In simple terms, even if you are normotensive, excess salt intake can obviously hurt you. And of course, some of our patients tell us that we take a very expensive salt. It's priced at 500 rupees for a bottle. But we need to realize that the so-called expensive pink salt is 99% sodium chloride. And it's the same with the so-called black salt. So there's no difference between an expensive salt and the ordinary common table salt. What about sugar, honey, jaggery? We have recently celebrated Makar Sankranti across India, and we take a lot of sweets during this time. It actually boils down mostly to the amount of calories that you are taking. And in terms of the calories per 100 gram, they are very closely matched. Yes, of course, honey has about 10-15% lower calorie per 100 gram because about 15% of honey is water. But then again, when you measure these by spoonfuls, don't use these by mugfuls or bucketfuls. If you measure them by spoonfuls, there's actually not much difference. Of course, there's a difference in terms of glycemic index, so that honey hits your postprandial glucose level less hard than that of sugar or jaggery. So yes, honey would be a somewhat better option than sugar or jaggery in terms of having a flatter postprandial carbohydrate peak, but calorie-wise, it's not very much different. Yes, it has nutrients and antioxidants, but they are there only in trace amounts. So if you actually have to benefit from the additional nutrients, you have to take half a liter of honey, which would hurt you anyway. Jaggery is a bit more nutrient dense. It has more iron, more magnesium, more potassium than many other substances. It would give you some additional nutrients, but you do have to keep the total calories in mind. And what happens is that since the perceived sweetness of honey and jaggery is less than that of sugar, people often end up taking more of these to satisfy their sweet tooth, and at the end, the calorie intake actually increases. So what about food intake? It's the same story with food. What matters at the end of the day is the total amount of calories that you are taking. Fruits, of course, are a rich source of fibers, of vitamins as well. But if you look at the amount of carbohydrate per 100 grams of fruit, or roughly the amount of fruit that you could hold in a small cup, it's always better to eat 2 apples than a banana to satisfy your sweet tooth for fruit, to satisfy your hunger. But of course, you can eat any and every fruit that you see here on the screen. The only thing that you need to keep in mind is that the amount of calories that 100 gram of fruit is going to give you. What about non-nutritive sweeteners, saccharin, aspartame, sucralose? Are they going to help us reduce body weight? Common sense tells us that yes, if we take these, they are going to help us reduce body weight. But evidence actually doesn't always point to the same. If you look at studies, if you look at randomized controlled trials, if we pull them together, weight loss has not been seen in general if we take these trials together with non-nutritive sweeteners. There were some trials which put additional behavioral interventions along with non-nutritive sweeteners and achieve weight loss, but overall it was neutral in terms of weight loss. Rather, observational studies have shown that you could actually gain weight when you take non-nutritive sweeteners, because of the fact that when you are taking these sweeteners, you are not taking them alone. You're taking them with other carbohydrates, and you often overeat food, increase your carbohydrate intake along with these non-nutritive sweeteners. These sweeteners do not satisfy the so-called sweet tooth of our brain. Our craving for sugar increases, and we end up taking more refined sugar. And the other hypothesis is that these non-nutritive sweeteners could hurt your gut microbiome, which in turn could lead to greater weight gain. When it comes to fat, again, the popular notion that fat kills is not always correct, because if we look at a pooled analysis of about 10 of these studies, high dietary fat versus low dietary fat did not result in more all-cause mortality. The Nurses' Health Study, Women's Health Initiative, these similarly showed that high fat intake versus low fat intake doesn't result in more cardiovascular disease. Although the amount of fat is not important, the type of fat might be important. And you know that popularly saturated fatty acids have been given a bad name. But if you look at a pooled analysis of lakhs of participant data involving thousands of events, of coronary events, saturated fat actually sits more or less in the midline. In comparison, trans fat is worse because it actually leads to more coronary events, whereas omega-3 fatty acids, which is found in fish oils, could actually lead to, or there's a trend towards, a decrease in coronary events. And studies which have looked at replacing saturated fatty acids with other types of fats have shown us that replacing saturated fats with trans fats and refined sugars could actually worsen outcomes. They are worse than saturated fats, whereas replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats or whole grain carbohydrates could actually improve outcomes, reduce your cardiovascular risk. So the type of fat that you are taking is important, and the type of substitution for saturated fat which you are doing is also important when you are planning a dietary pattern. And as our chairperson said, we actually take food rather than isolated fat. And in terms of overall food intake, food which is rich in fat, various kinds of fat, nuts and seeds have shown some of the best cardiovascular outcomes. Fish, of course, is good for most cardiovascular outcomes. Meat, red meat in general, increases cardiovascular risk, whereas saturated fat, which comes from dairy products, usually is either neutral or good for your overall cardiovascular health. Now, a big study which looked at fat intake included data from nearly 1.3 lakh patients, followed up for about 7 years, 18 different studies pulled together, showed that if your total fat intake was somewhere between 20 to 45% of your total calorie intake, you were actually not increasing total mortality. Rather, fat intake less than 20% of your total daily energy intake could increase total mortality, because in that case, fat would often be replaced by refined carbohydrates. And the study showed that saturated fatty acids could constitute about 8 to 12%, 13%, 14% even of your total energy intake without leading to an increase in total mortality. Rather, if saturated fats constituted less than 70% of your total intake, it could actually increase mortality by increasing hemorrhagic stroke. Now, this study also looked at the sweet spot of carbohydrates, but this was another study which actually gave a better impression about the amount of energy that we could safely take from carbohydrates. And this showed that if you take about 50 to 55% of your energy from carbohydrates, you actually hit that sweet spot where your overall mortality is low. Lower carbohydrate intakes as well as higher carbohydrate intakes was associated with increased mortality. And this also showed that if your carbohydrate intake was lower than, say, 50%, and if you replaced it mostly with animal proteins and fat, you increase your mortality. Whereas if you replaced it with plant protein and fat, you actually could have a neutral or beneficial outcome. So yes, you need to keep in mind that your total fat intake could be healthy around 20 to 45%. Your carbohydrate intake is healthy at around the 55 to 60% mark. And if you are taking lower amounts of carbohydrate, you need to replace that mostly with plant protein and fat rather than with animal protein and fat. Now, what about eggs and cholesterol? We know that eggs contain about 200 grams of cholesterol. So if you have to restrict your cholesterol intake to say about 200 or 300 milligrams per day, you get most of it from a single egg. So what do you do? But actually, when we talk of cholesterol, serum cholesterol is not too much dependent on our diet. It's mostly dependent on our hepatic biosynthesis of cholesterol, and obese and overweight individuals actually absorb less cholesterol from the diet and synthesize more of it in the liver. And if you take high cholesterol diets, there's actually a feedback mechanism which reduces hepatic cholesterol synthesis. So at the end of the day, in the majority of our population, an egg actually changes your serum cholesterol by 2 to 3%. In 1/3 of our population who are hyper responders, yes, the cholesterol levels could increase, but the overall increase is of a pattern where both the LDL and HDL increases, maintaining a good LDL to HDL ratio. The particle size of LDL and HDL increases, so that at the end of the day, the simple message is for most people, taking an egg along with its yolk per day is not going to harm you. And mind you, about 40% of the total protein content of an egg lies in its yolk. Only 60% is in the egg white. Now, what about water? There's a notion that if you drink a lot of water, you're going to keep your kidneys healthy, but it's actually the other way around. If you drink too much water, you're going to hyperfiltrate, and that could actually be one of the risk factors for progression of chronic kidney disease. So you need to follow your thirst. And if you have normal sodium level and your blood pressure is controlled, a simple guide would be to take your output, add 500 ml to it, which decides your input. What about protein intake and kidney disease? Because there's a notion that, and it's not a notion, there's actually science that low protein diet could help you in terms of avoiding a worse outcome from kidney disease. And if you look at the biggest study till date, the meta-analysis, which included a protein intake, the so-called low protein diet, with an intake of about 0.3 to 0.9 grams per kg per day per protein, which was about 0.2 to 1.1 gram per kg per day different from the normal or high protein diet. Yes, there was a significant decline in end-stage renal disease, but importantly, the overall mortality did not decrease, and there was a significant decrease in the body mass index. Importantly, the populations that were taken in this analysis were grossly heterogeneous, which means that individualization is the key. In a country like India, where many of our individuals with chronic kidney disease are lean, the best thing would be to stick to a protein intake of about 0.8 grams per kg per day in most of them. Lower intakes of 0.6 gram per kg per day would be helpful in certain cases, but it has to be paired with intake of keto acids, which always requires a trained dietitian to formulate a diet plan. And of course, patients with hemodialysis would require greater amounts of protein because of the catabolic state and loss in their dialysate. What about hyperuricemia and diet? The most important message here would be that the so-called high purine vegetables, spinach, cabbage, or certain legumes being on the top of the list, do not increase your uric acid level. They could rather reduce your uric acid level. It's the same with dairy, coffee, vitamin C, all of which reduce your uric acid levels. So the things that we actually need to avoid an increase in uric acid are, of course, alcohol, meat, particularly red meat, not lean poultry, seafood in general, and of course, fructose or sugar-sweetened beverages. Now, what about a so-called thyroid diet? Now, we need to keep in mind that when we administer levothyroxine, it has to be taken in an empty stomach, and you need to keep your stomach empty for the next 30 to 60 minutes because anything even as simple as tea or coffee could interfere with its absorption. But overall, there is no called special thyroid diet. The amount of iodine that we get from our daily salt intake is sufficient for a healthy thyroid. And selenium supplementation has a role in very, very specific settings. Cruciferous vegetables and soya bean have been often labeled as villains when it comes to the thyroid, but overall studies have shown that they do not usually affect your thyroid function unless you take about a kilogram of raw vegetables every day for 1 or 2 years at a stretch. Soybean, however, or soy milk formula could increase levothyroxine requirement in infants with congenital hypothyroidism, but in general in adults, they do not interfere with thyroid absorption or thyroid function. And of course, there is no specific diet which influences thyroid antibody levels. So coming towards the end of my talk, what would be the best dietary pattern? Again, this is a vote which happens annually. And like the past few years, Mediterranean diet followed by the DASH and flexitarian diet have been voted the best dietary patterns. If you look at the so-called best dietary patterns, they usually consist of fruits, vegetables, fish, whole grain, and have dairy products with moderation of alcohol and restriction of red meat. On the other hand, if you look at the worst diets, ketogenic diet is the third worst diet in this list. If we briefly look at Mediterranean diet, it's a diet which promotes intake of fats actually, either through the intake of extra virgin olive oil or mixed nuts. This trial, the so-called Predimed trial, which established the efficacy of the Mediterranean diet, showed that a high fat intake of about 48% of your total energy coming from fat versus a low fat intake of about 30% of your total energy coming from fat actually resulted in a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's the quality of fat which is important. Fats coming from nuts, vegetables, and fish is healthy compared to fat from other sources. On the other hand, a lot still needs to be learned about the ketogenic diet, but we know that it is fraught with certain risks. There are reports of patients landing up in the ICU with electrolyte disturbances, acute kidney injury. People often have a problem adjusting to the diet because of constipation or nausea. And of course, kidney stones have also been reported with it. It does have certain short-term advantages, but the long-term benefits are largely unknown. Some other popular dietary myths that just need to be briefed through. One is with regard to calcium. But however, dietary calcium is good in terms of reducing heart disease and renal stones. However, if you overdo with calcium supplementation, you could actually increase renal stones. The data on heart disease is a bit sketchy. You actually don't need any special diet to detoxify your system. Most food are better digested when they are cooked well. There's no data on dietary supplements. A whole fruit is always healthier than fruit juice, and high fructose corn syrup and the dietary sugar that we use in our home are equally bad. And the most important message to remember is that if a patient is on a weight losing diet, the weight loss is not always linear. Most of this weight loss will occur in the first year, and thereafter it will gradually have a downward slope. Because once you lose body weight, your resting energy expenditure comes down and your body tends to preserve more of its body weight. And if you put in the effect of gut microbiota on top of it, we still have a lot to learn. So I would like to end with the message that when we talk of diet, there are a lot of myths where we often overdo the diet. We need to still keep the pleasure of eating alive. That is equally important. We do not eat individual carbohydrates or fats, but we eat food stuff in general. So we need to maintain a healthy dietary pattern. At the same time, we need to keep in mind that interventions like physical exercise and avoidance of smoking might have even greater or equal benefits as compared to a healthy diet. So I end my part of the discussion and hand it over back to our chairperson.
Thank you very much, Shomik. I'm sure everyone would agree that was a very succinct, lucid eye-opener actually for many of us in relation to so many of the myths. And I would maybe point out a few important issues that you have established. One is about the harmful effects of salt. While we maybe bother too much about fat, the type of oil, salt intake overall, and that's a WHO program actually to try and reduce the salt intake significantly across the globe in order to reduce mortality. The other issue was about saturated fat. Well, yes, saturated fat does contribute to increasing the LDL cholesterol level, even the cholesterol level. But possibly the bigger rogue is trans fat. And then about the issue of eggs, probably, for many patients for whom I have said, please do not take the egg yolk, you are allowed to take the egg white. Now, possibly the evidence, and most patients would respond, many patients would respond by saying, if I'm not allowed to take the egg yolk, what's the fun of taking an egg? I don't want to take the egg white, then I'll skip an egg altogether. And possibly now we have evidence that for most people, possibly an average size egg a day, a whole egg, including the yolk, is not harmful. And it goes on and on. But I think we already have quite a few questions in our chat box, but I think we will wait till we have heard Dr. Ranjini Datta. She is in charge of the Department of Dietetics at the KPC Medical College, again in Kolkata. And as we promised, she will provide us with a practical way to devise a healthy diet. Over to you, Dr. Ranjini Datta. You can unmute yourself and also start presenting.
Before I go into today's presentation, a warm evening to this cold January day, though it's not as cold as we would want it to be in Calcutta, I believe. And I would like to thank Professor Chaudhary for giving me this platform to talk on a pan-India basis. And I've tried to stick to my brief, and I've tried to stay away from clinical jargons as much as possible and bring somebody else to the center stage today. That is that little thing that's been lying discreetly on our kitchen shelves, the grocery bag. And that is what I'm going to talk about today mostly, how friendly or unfriendly we could make our grocery bag. And I would just like to give me a minute while I share my screen and I'll just take a minute. Do bear with me for a minute. It seems that I can't get back to my computer. Yeah, so here we are. And
Madam, we are yet to see your slides.
Yes, just give me a minute. My share option doesn't seem to be functioning, and
okay, share screen at the bottom doesn't.
Yes, I don't seem to be getting that function here. And
okay. So have you shared it with the INTAS team?
Yeah, it's shared with them as well. Yeah, it's shared with them as well.
Can you kindly start sharing the screen, whoever is at the back end? And then you have to, of course, tell them change the slide and so on.
Yeah, I would just want to get back to my screen. I really don't know why this doesn't seem to be responding. And thank everyone for kindly bearing with me. It seems I'm a little technologically challenged. Actually, I'm not, but I don't know why today wasn't quite my day. So let's, without much ado, get into it. And well, as Sir has been mentioning, as Dr. Goswami mentioned, food glorious food. But the problem that we do face often is, do we know how much to eat and where to stop? And as I said, let's not get into all that technical and clinical jargons that are all around us, and let us just stick to our grocery bag today. I have just talked about the pyramid, a very known figure. We seem to be seeing this like almost everywhere. Everything that is even remotely related to food these days would have a picture of these pyramids on it: the Indian pyramid, the Mediterranean pyramid, and the various other typical clinical related pyramids. You've got a diabetic pyramid, you've got a hypertensive pyramid. There are pyramids all around us. But the problem, the tiny bit of problem that exists is, do we know that whether that particular pyramid that we are viewing is actually meant for us? Like, for example, let's say the Mediterranean food pyramid. One of the most voted, yes. But the problem is, we don't live in Cyprus and Malta, and therefore what we've been taught is we don't use oils as just a salad dressing. Rather, we would like to take a fish and deep fry it in the oil, leading to simply making the carbons and the oxygen and the hydrogens all come as no longer within the bonds that were there in the oil, rather plain and simple carbon particles which would be settling at the very bottom of our cauldron. And that's where it all goes wrong. And finally, this is probably the pyramid that is all around us today. And like it was being discussed by Dr. Goswami, when the Industrial Revolution took place, along with it, it did change the entire global food web. Yes, we are all actually the part of the global food web. And the global food web was actually dictated by the Industrial Revolution, and then in India and in most of the third world countries by the Green Revolution that happened. And when the Green Revolution happened, what was the primary goal? The primary goal was to increase the staples of that country. In India and in the other third world countries or the low to medium income countries, what got increased were the cereal-based products. And then what came into the play was the different processing industries that would process cereals into not just something on your staple platter, rather into foods that you could simply pick off the shelf. And that is where the question comes: do we know how much to consume? And more importantly, do we know when to stop? If I do take this question of this empirical math of do we know where to stop, then what actually comes into our mind is two words: portion size and serving size. Something we have been quite frequently, this has been faced. We are faced with these two words, and most of us takes it synonymously. Portion size is equivalent to a serving size, when actually they are very, very different. What is a portion size? A portion size is what I choose to eat, what you choose to eat. When you go to our dhaba, when you go to a restaurant, when you order your food off Swiggy, they will tell you a particular portion size. Something which is completely in either your hand or in the hand of your food server. And here, when I talk about food server, I do not necessarily talk about the standardizing authorities. I do not essentially talk about the people who have fixed the serving size. In India, who are these authorities? It's NI in Hyderabad, it's FSSAI, or it can even be a particular organization who are fixing their own serving size. For example, I'm from KPC. we have a standard serving size of the various diets that we are giving to the patients. And the standard serving size is available in our SOPs, it's available in our manuals, it's available as there as a knowledge which we want the users to know. And by users, I mean the clinicians, the nursing personnel who are involved in this entire diet decision process. Now, the serving sizes are multiples. When I was a student way back in the 90s, NIN used to stick to serving sizes as katoris, cups, spoons. Now, the problem is, which I have been facing, and this is very practical. We were told about it as a student, and I faced it when I was practicing, is the katori is not universal. The sizes are not universal. There's a saying in Bengali, choto bati theke ekta jam bati, which if translated to English would mean your katori could be as small as a dhakkan to something as big as a cauldron. And that is exactly where your portion sizes come into play. And what we often ignore is serving sizes sometimes take into account certain portion sizes which can be more than once, or if I put it the other way, portion sizes can take into account more than one serving size. If any of us would actually pick up a packaged food and look at the label, we'll find that many a times they mention a particular serving size while the packaging is of far more a quantity than one serving size. Now, I was talking about the Industrial Revolution. It was mentioned in the previous discourse. I was talking about the global food wave. Basically, what increased in our portion sizes over the year was what could be easily manufactured. What took a setback, or what stepped back, was basically those kinds of food which could not be manufactured on a large scale, which could not use those tractors, those high yield varieties of seeds. What came into the forefront was those refined and processed food, and in India, those refined carbohydrates, which was the most economical because they were our staples. And drastically, the portion sizes increased. And what of the portion size increased? It is the refined carbohydrates that increased in the portion size, leading to what today we call an boom in the syndrome X disorders, which can be traced back to diet being one of the culprits. Someone might say, I just had one cup of, a small cup of a particular cola a particular day. Right, 100 kilocalories might not seem too much to you, but let me give you a reverse data. A child who is not receiving 500 kilocalories or is receiving less than 500 kilocalories as per his requirement, as just mentioned in the RDA, could fall below the third SD curve on the WHO growth chart. So here, if you're talking about 100 calorie extra, just do the math. And with that, let me come to the serving sizes. As you could very well see that I have first taken vegetables and fruits instead of talking about the staples, that's the carbohydrate in my initial slide of the serving sizes. That's because what Sir was mentioning, diet is not a pill. Monotony is something which often seems to creep into a diet if you are actually trying to, fix it to a regime which is not flexible. And it's basically our fruits and vegetables that breaks the monotony of our diet. Now, all clinical diets, all physiological condition diets are basically in both ways generic and empirical. Like, for example, if I am diabetic and my grandmother is diabetic, both of us might be having a generic proximate principle requirement, a generic micronutrient requirement, but what will become different is I am more used to eating new fashion seeds while my grandmother is probably more used to eating chapatis. And if my grandmother is asked to take quinoa and I'm asked to take homemade chapatis every day, both of us are simply going to fail our dietary regime. And that's the reason why vegetables and fruits, most of these vegetables and fruits come under something which used to be called an exchange list. Though nowadays it is no longer considered to be practical, it's almost obsolete because, as I was saying, the proximate principles of most of the fruits and vegetables may be same, but their micronutrient constituent often varies to a large extent. And these are the fruits and vegetables standard serving sizes. And now let me come to the cereals and protein foods. As we all know that cereals are more or less our diet, while protein food is also something which is not very varied. For example, being a Bengali, I am more used to fish protein than any other protein. Somebody living in the northern parts of India is probably more used to animal protein, preferably a lean meat or a white meat protein, and not that much into a fish protein regime. So protein foods usually should not be, taken as an substitute to one another, because in most cases they aren't. And finally, our milk products, as it was already mentioned, milk products are one of your safest protein if you think about the fat constituent, because the fat of milk is mostly stearic acid, which of course will not go into or will not enter your cholesterol synthesis pathway. And with that, I come to what I wanted to talk about so while long. What could be your actual portion sizes? So is it every time we plan to cook or eat, we take a weighing scale? I mean, that would be a simple horror, everyday horror. So what do? We simply go by certain rules, and the 3-2-1 portion rule is probably the simplest that one could go with. Imagine a plate. Imagine 3 parts of your plate being filled with your staples, your rice, your millets, your chapatis. 2 parts of it being filled with your vegetable proteins and your vegetables, and 15% of it being filled with your non-vegetable proteins and your milk products. And all that is just done to trick your brain, because you need to feel full and you also need to have attained satiety at the end of your meal. And that, believe me, does not come if you are looking at the World Cup on the television or flipping through your favorite magazine while you are unmindfully eating, because then the center stage is no longer your food, which should have been the protagonist of the entire arc. So how do we do that? How do we bring the food to be the protagonist? Simple techniques to fool your brain. We use smaller dinnerware. A large plate, small serving of food. You look at it and you wonder, oh dear, this is my life. I am dieting. And dieting, by the way, is not about not eating food. It is more about eating the right kind of food at the right time. And no diet is a correct diet unless and until it is giving you adequate satiety. That's the key word, satiety. You should be happy about what you're eating. You should not be feeling either guilty about binging, and neither should you be feeling like, the entire world's on top of you. You're in the doldrums because you are forced to look at a plate full of some sprouts or something which you would rather put it into your bin, your garbage bin, and you are forced to eat it. Then that diet is not successful. So smaller dinnerware, and there have been studies which have proved that simple changing your plate size, just serving the food on a smaller plate, can do the trick, and people feel happy and they get this feeling of fullness, a feeling of a full appetite even when they eat the same amount of food on a smaller plate, and the feeling of not getting a full meal when the same amount of food is served to them on a larger plate. In fact, we've all gone to these buffet meals, we've all experienced them, and I remember one of the caterers once telling me it actually doesn't matter, because at one time, a person, the human stomach, can take in as much as only 300 ml of a bolus. I mean, I'm sure many of us who've been experiencing the shortage of drip feeding meters when we are trying to Riles tube feed or any PEG tube feeds to a patient, and we try to give a bolus feed. If it's more than 300 ml, there are chances of aspiration, there are chances of diarrhea. And yes, I just would like to waver a little from the topic out here. And as it was being said about the myths, a clinical myth is too many numbers of albumin can actually bring up the albumin level. No, it doesn't. The egg whites only end to inducing diarrhea in the patient. Okay, that aside. So then we come to another interesting thing where we are using our hands as our serving size. If you look at this, this is basically using my palm size or my feast size to decipher what would be the ideal portion size or what could have been the ideal serving size of a particular kind of food. And other tricks are, when you're mostly eating out, ask for half a portion of what you're eating. And the next one is what I have tried out with many people on myself. When we are happily ordering that soup at the restaurant, half your appetite is gone. In fact, I remember when I was younger and I would be dragged to one of these parties, which I never intended to go to by my parents, my mom would give me glares if I was busy, dumping in those wonderful soups that used to be served. And I know the reason now today. It's very obvious. It's common sense. If half of your appetite, half of your stomach is filled with liquids, it's only the other half remaining for your calorie-dense foods. The last thing is a food diary. Though it sounds cumbersome, if you actually start putting down what you've written, actually start making a food journal, and from there taking ideas to become a food blogger maybe, food journals, you get to count your portion size, and slowly it starts becoming a lifestyle habit. And now just visualize your satiety center, visualize your hypothalamus, go into the middle of it, the ventromedial nuclei, and then you just Photoshop your supermarket with those lovely goodies, those I want to be eaten foods on the shelves, or your fine dining outlet, and then visualize how much you want to eat. Half that portion, take double the time you take to eat. When you're eating, talk to your partner, talk to your friend, just don't look at those magazines. And more often than not, you would be full. You will find that you've achieved satiety and you are full. And in case you're still hungry, we'll start all over. But that's going to be a very rare case. And now, how many of you read the fine prints on the previous slides? The eyes and the nose. And I'm sure the people at the back end would find out the nose have it. Let me go back. The mental map can tell you how much you ate and without making you feeling starved. So why am I just mentioning this? Am I being mischievous? No. Who's been mischievous with you? The manufacturers, because food label reading is what we often ignore. Food label reading is basically one of the biggest way out of this difficult algorithm of processed food wave that is all around us. But reading labels could be quite tricky. When you pick up a food, the best thing to avoid or not to believe are those big words which are there staring right into your face. Turn the label, turn the packet. Once you are on the back side, go for the fine print. The finer the print, the more the truth is there in it. Basically, what you need to do is start reading the first 3 ingredients of your food label. And if you find that one ingredient is there, which is almost a line long, it's almost as similar to floxinosin nihilipilification, trust me, you are getting into eating a processed food. Thumb rule, the first 3 ingredients. Another very misleading claim, and we've been just hearing about this in the previous discourse, foods which are actually myths are often placed to us in a way that you believe that they are the messiah in your health situation. And as you can see, this is almost a fine print. The slides are almost a fine print, and I intentionally did that because you could probably fill up the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, but you would still won't run out of the various kinds of light, multigrain, organic, no added sugar, low calorie, low carb, whatnot and whatnot and whatnot, zero trans fat, etc., blah, 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 that a manufacturer will think of and put it onto the label. In fact, I was a part of the FSSAI team about a very reputable aerated drink company who wanted to bring out a fruit drink. They called it a fruit drink. And when we had the lab analysis reports, we found that there was less than 2% of fruit in it. And then we went back to the government regulation and we found somewhere in fine print it's mentioned anything which has around 1.8% of a particular ingredient in it can be called by that name. So there we go. A fruit drink which actually had 25% or even more of chemical flavoring of that particular food and essence, and basically nothing but plain and simple sugar was being marketed as a fruit drink. And one last thing that I would like to talk about is there's something that none of us often pay heed to, and which brings us back to those various kinds of fad diets which you will find off the net. These are advanced glycation end products. The more the processed, the more the cooking, the more the frying, the more the advanced glycation end products, and more the havoc that they cause. And the worst part of the story is they are not only linked to our various kinds of syndromic diseases, they are there to increase all kinds of pro-inflammatory responses, all those interleukins and the TNF factors in our bodies. And the worst part being, nobody would tell you that on the label. They are not even there in the fine print. A quick physiological response flowchart, which I wouldn't get into explaining. And the highest amount of AG being those in preheated processed food, and the least being those which you get in your nukkar ka or vegetables. The poor guy who's been organic all his life, but then suddenly some multinational company, some multi-trillion dollar company comes in to say that, we are selling something which is organic, while vermicompost has probably been the way of the life of my nukkar ka vegetable wala. And the last thing that I want to talk about is go kosher. No, I am not propagating Judaism out here. Happy Hanukkah is long gone, 15 days maybe. What I'm talking about is also not drug diet interaction, not diet interaction, the plain and simple fact that a particular kind of proximate principle is digested and absorbed at a particular time and rate and by a particular enzyme, and various pHs, various functionalities of these enzymes differ. So basically, if you are mixing up various kinds of foods like milk and meat together, you are actually asking your body to metabolize either one of it first and the other much later. Fruit being notorious for this. And then you blame your diet regime, or then you blame your pure constituents as to, I have a poor constituent and I really don't seem to be digesting my food, when the problem actually was you trying to mix up ingredients which just don't go together. And with that, I would like to end my discourse. Thank you very much. And thank you, sir, once again. And I would like to apologize for the initial glitch that happened, and for all of you kindly and patiently bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ranjini. It was a very nice talk. We all enjoyed. We already have quite a few questions in the chat box. Let us get through some of those, and then maybe we can come back to the quiz. So the first one may be addressed to Dr. Soumi Goswami. So why do we have Soumi Goswami, an endocrinologist, talking to us about diet? So the question Dr. Stephen Iyer asks is, how does endocrine system relate to nutrition?
So as endocrinologists, we also deal with metabolic diseases. We deal with obesity, we deal with diabetes. And of course, it also depends on your personal preference. I do have a preference for reading up about diet. So that's why possibly I was a part of this discourse. But then again, we speak of obesity, we speak of dyslipidemia, diabetes. The RAS system is altered in a number of chronic inflammatory conditions. So yes, hormones do have a role to play. And of course, the alteration in your hormones, your gut hormones, have to do with your hunger, your satiety. So as endocrinologists, we are a part of the jigsaw puzzle. We don't form up the entire puzzle, but we are a crucial part of the jigsaw puzzle which deals with obesity and dietary patterns.
Absolutely. Can we quickly ask Dr. Ranjini Datta? Dr. Kishan Raj wants to know the difference between brown and white sugar.
Myth, actually. Palmyra sugar, which was mentioned in the very first discourse by Dr. Goswami, is basically brown sugar. Demerara sugar will have the same amount of calories as white sugar, and they both are more or less empty calories. As it was mentioned, you probably need to consume 2 kgs of palm juice or akhir gur, taler gur, etc. to have the micronutrients benefits of palm sugar. So basically, no, it's the same thing, just a packaging making you believe that you are eating something healthy.
Right.
And if I could just add, when the molasses are there with the sugar, that's brown sugar. It's simple as that.
And sometimes it's just sugar that's caramelized. It's the worst kind of thing.
That's even worse. That's even worse.
Yeah. And many of the honey that you have in the market now recently was found to have mostly sugar syrup. We have Dr. V.S. Vincent asking us, Eskimos hardly eat any carbohydrates, seem to keep themselves very healthy. Any comments? Before maybe someone else takes it, I think this is another myth about Eskimos being very healthy. I mean, I think there are not a whole lot of studies, but whatever studies are available do show that actually they do not have any lower risk of heart attacks or strokes, and actually suggest possibly they have a lower life expectancy, lower longevity compared to maybe a standard North European population. So does anyone have any comments on that?
Sir, I would just like to add one more thing, that this Eskimo diet is actually defining what we call the specific dynamic action or the thermogenic effect of food. Yeah. I am living in the middle of North Pole. It's cold all around. Protein gives the highest specific dynamic action. And here I'm living way down in almost a tropical country. Almost in the tropics. I really don't need to relate to what's happening in Greenland up there. My body won't understand. My genes are completely different.
Yeah. Dr. Goswami, this is Dr. Paresh Mandal, diet advice for patient of hypothyroidism. I think you touched a little bit about it, but do you have a diet advice?
The only advice would be to avoid taking anything except for a glass of water for 30 to 60 minutes after popping their levothyroxine tablet in the morning. And only in congenital hypothyroidism in infants, if you take soy milk as a replacement for your mother's milk, even later on, that would increase your levothyroxine dose. That has been seen. We'll just briefly go through two studies. In a study, volunteers in the United States were given kale juice, Kale, which is one of the vegetables which produces thiocyanates. They were asked to drink it twice daily for a week. It was found that there was a slight decrease in thyroid radioiodine uptake, but the thyroid function was not different. It was similar. There is one report of myxedema coma in an elderly Chinese woman who took these vegetables, a vegetable called bok choy, which is one of the ones producing thiocyanates.
Right.
She took 1 to 1.5 kgs of raw bok choy for 2 years continuously to treat her diabetes and ended up with myxedema coma. So yes, there's that one case report, raw vegetables, 1 to 1.5 kgs regularly for 2 years. There's nothing else to worry about.
Yeah, and whatever vegetables we suggest may interfere with thyroid function, you have to take that exclusively, both morning, evening, night, in order to have significant effect on your thyroid function.
And mostly raw.
And sir, if
Right.
I add, not just the crucifera, even the nightshade vegetables are considered a culprit when they're actually not.
Yeah. And we have, shall we, would Dr. Ranjini like to take this? Dr. Prerna Singhal, what's the role of protein supplements with workout?
Well, if you are
And it's also suggested that you need to take a whey milkshake within 30 minutes of your workout to have the best result.
When we are post-workout, my cells are most sensible to insulin, and that is the time when, if I actually want to get the benefits of the workout, I need to glycogen supercompensate. I do not want any proteins to break down. I do not want my glycogenic amino acids to break down. And whey proteins contain much more glycogenic amino acids than the ketogenic amino acids, which are actually prescribed if you are on a low protein diet, which would actually not break down and, give you energy. So these 100% whey supplements, which cost you more than a Rolls Royce these days, and people spend everything they have, and you have these gym trainers telling you, this particular brand of whey protein. Well, sadly, it doesn't work. I mean, you don't need that whey protein. Our normal Indian diet of a banana and maybe an egg and some sprouts or maybe just some chapati would serve you much better than those expensive protein supplements.
Right. And for Dr. Somik Goswami, Dr. Vinay Bajaj would want to know how much fluid restriction is recommended in patients with CKD grades 2 to 4 on diuretics. I think we cannot provide a blanket advice,
Exactly.
but Somik, yeah. So would you like to
it
take
has to be individualized. If there's underlying heart failure, you have raised JVP, you have a dependent edema, then you would possibly reduce it to, say, your output plus, it could even be only plus 200 ml. If you are in summer, it could be plus 500 ml. In winter, in certain situations, you could even match your intake with your output. So it has to be individualized. There's no fixed rule.
Right. So I think we have gone through some of the questions. If we have some more time, can Dr. Ranjini come up with the quizzes, and maybe we see people get prizes also.
I would request the backend team to kindly come up with it. There we go. So I've been talking about this now. Here's your chance to prove how much you've been hearing. What's a serving size for cereals? And for this cereals, I mean breakfast cereals. And that's will be 5 seconds on the clock. And can we go for the answer now? The next slide, please. Can we go for the next slide, please? Could I request my backend team to kindly go to the next slide? The answer to the slide, could I request Dr. Naik to kindly go to the answer? Yeah, there we go. cup of cold cereal, or a cup of breakfast cereal as we commonly call it, is in the size of a baseball. Slightly bigger than your cricket ball or your tennis ball, and way smaller than your football. The next question. The serving size of pasta or refined vegetable, once again, on the counts of baseball. And that would be 3 seconds on the clock. Could we go for the answer, please? So half a cup of pasta, and by rice here, we mean polished rice and not your traditional parboiled, what we call in Bengali, the dhiki chata chal, which would not even fall into this category. We are talking about your polished long grain basmatis here. Next question, please. Serving size of meat. Please don't confuse this with white meat. We are talking about something which is a game bird or bigger. And that would be 3 seconds on the clock. Could we get the answer, please? Could the back, yeah, there we go. Is the size of a deck of cards. One single deck of cards. Give or take the joker. The next question, please. Serving size of fish. And yes, that's what I meant by a checkbook. Please excuse my typographical error. It would be CHEQUE. I don't know how it got auto-corrected to checking off itself, but you need to check off the correct answer. And that's 3 seconds on the clock. Could we go for the answer, please? And how many of you got that checked correct? Next question. Cube of cheese. Your favorite brand. The taste of India. What's the serving size? And there's your reference dice there. And that would be 3 seconds on the clock. Can we go for the answer, please? And this was mentioned, if you had been going through the slides, this was mentioned in today's discourse. Next question. Okay, another variant of the cheese. 3 seconds. Can we go for the answer? And how many of you guessed that correct? Next question, please. I specifically wanted to mention hash brown potatoes because it seems quite a fashion these days. You can't seem to be having your burgers without your French fries and your hash brown. While I don't know why aloo ki tikki never got so much of a glamorized placement in our daily diet routine. The answer, please. Can we go to the next slide? The answer slide, please. Could the backend team kindly go to the next slide? And there you go. So next time you think about your hash brown, think about your soap bar. Peanut butter. And this is being propagated as probably a better alternative to your normal makhan, but that is something you need to be very careful about because at the end of the day, both are going to give you fats. So, you know, if you're putting in peanut butter and thinking that it's better than your normal regular makhan, well, you're mistaken. And the answer, please. There we go. Question number 9, please. Salad dressing, and this is where your Mediterranean diet comes in. Extra virgin olive oil is not meant for deep frying your fishes. It's just meant for sprinkling on your salads, which we don't do? The answer, please. Okay, this is something that you can probably relate to. I have compared it to an alcoholic beverage. I mean, your normally shot glasses and your tequila shots. The next question. The serving size of juice. And this goes for all kind of packaged juice, including ones which are pulpy, ones which come from citrus origins. And that would be 3 seconds on the clock. Can we go for the answer? How many of you knew that? I mean, I was quite amazed when I get to learn about this particular fact. The next question. That'll be 3 seconds on the clock. Can we go for the answer, please? And there is your tennis ball. A little smaller than your baseball, almost your cricket ball. The next question, please. Peanuts, once again, be it butter, be it your afternoon ka moongfali. What's the serving size? And can we go for the answer slide, please? And there we go. The next question. Grapes. One of those fruits which have a huge amount of myths associated with them. Some call it good because they are a good source of resveratrol, but then how much of resveratrol do we actually need given the fact that we are getting various other forms of antioxidants if you stick to the actual Indian diet? The answer, please. The penultimate question. Can we please go to the next question, the penultimate question? I used broccoli intentionally because these days it seems to be more fashionable to eat broccolis instead of our age-old cauliflower. Not that they give you too much of excess amount of lycopene or zeaxanthin, but I don't know, it seems to be a fad. Can we go for the answer? And now can we go for the last question? Serving size of a pea pod. You don't want to go to the actual peas by themselves because that would be too much of a calculation. And the final answer to today's quizzing session. Can we have the final answer, please? I hope you had a roaring time playing this small little eye estimation quiz. And sir, the session's back to you.
Thank you very much. I think all of you enjoyed as much as I did. And it has been a glimpse into the vast area of discussing about food, nutrition, diet. And we do understand that patients quite often are a little bit reluctant to follow our advice. And we often find that they come back, for example, in a patient with diabetes, whatever we might say the next time, also they may come back and tell us, doctor, I have not been eating the potatoes. I have been taking only chapatis, no rice. Still, the sugar level remains the same. Though clearly the advice doesn't suggest that as a person with diabetes, you cannot have potatoes or that chapatis is the only way to go. You cannot have rice. We do really have a wide choice. We need to make the best use of the vast repertoire of food actually that we have with us in the Indian diet, including the condiments, the spices that we have. which also are supposed to provide us sort of important elements that help in the metabolism. So there's a lot to learn, but I think it doesn't whet your appetite yet, but stimulates further to learn more and to provide a better educated advice to our patients. So I'd like to thank once again the panelists this evening, Dr. Somik Goswami and Dr. Ranjini Datta, for all the hard work that you put in and put in a lot of information in a limited amount of time. And of course, as in other previous editions of Practice Pearls in Endocrinology, we have almost become, have a big fan following these days, it seems, and at least about 1,000 doctors from around the country took their time off on a Saturday evening to learn more. And thank you for showing your interest, and of course, Intas Pharma for providing the platform. It's over to you for the comments, and we shall be back next month with a topic that we shall soon disclose that will hopefully interest you once again.
Thank you so much, sir. And behalf of Intas Pharmaceuticals, myself, Mudit Prashant, extends vote of thanks to our eminent course director, Dr. Professor Shuvankar Chaudhary. Sir, with your able guidance only, we could do this 8 webinars successfully in the series. I would also like to thank our esteemed faculty, Dr. Somik Goswami and Dr. Rajini Datta, for a very interesting and very informative session on diet demystified in a very simplified way. So thank you so much. And as I mentioned, over 1,000 plus doctors have attended. So I would like to thank each and every delegate who has spent their valuable time. This knowledge initiative has been brought to you by our support to Dapawell and Tiglipem. So do continue these events. And we shall be back on 20th Feb, as sir has already mentioned, with the 9th edition of this program. Till then, goodbye, and thank you so much for attending this session. Thank you, sir, and thank you.